terms of affordable housing, again, this is the biggest headline from the SHMA is just the sheer extent of affordable housing that's needed across the district in all locations, across all markets. The calculations within the SHMA put the net shortfall at 2,136 affordable homes per annum, and that's based on a 10-year period to remedy the backlog. And that in itself is an uplift of 900 more affordable homes per annum needed now than what was previously calculated. Mechanics of the 2017 SHMA. This is largely reflective of the existing waiting list, the cost of living crisis, and just the number of households that are currently obtaining some form of housing benefits. And Councillor Lennox discussed the workings of the private rental sector, and the numbers of households that are in the private rental sector that are receiving some form of housing benefit has increased significantly over the last few years, reflective of the challenges of the cost of living crisis. This is really despite the council's best efforts to increase the supply of affordable housing. We've had notable success over the last couple of years at least in increasing affordable housing delivery. But the problem is that affordability is running away from us because it's so difficult to keep pace with the increase in demand due to the cost of living crisis and the number of households receiving a household benefit. Nextly, on to housing mix. So the position that we have at the moment in the core strategy is a policy position that simply looks at the number of bedrooms at a citywide level. So when we come in to determine planning applications, we're looking at housing mix in a very narrow focus in terms of what can we look at in terms of the number of bedrooms that we require in a scheme. The SHMA gives us a much wider scope and more detailed evidence on the size, the type and the tenure, importantly, of properties that are needed at a sub-area geography. And that sub-area geography is based on the community committee areas plus the city centre. And what this provides us with an opportunity to do is to propose much more detailed planning policy requirements as part of the Leeds Local Plan 2040. We can have a much more detailed policy and the potential to look at that geographically by those sub-areas if we think that's an appropriate strategy. Moving on to student accommodation, and there's an appendix to the report, which is the Unipol research piece through the Student Housing Working Group, which the Council is part of. Indeed, the Council commissioned the research. On student housing, I think most people living in Leeds will recognise that student housing in Leeds has changed quite dramatically over the last few years. And we've seen almost an explosion of student accommodation schemes that have been built and continue to be proposed in and around the city centre. The SHMA looks across this and the report published by Unipol on the supply and demand of student accommodation through that Student Housing Working Group, and it identifies that rapid increase in supply and delivery of purpose-built student accommodation schemes and a shift away from what would be a traditional model of co-living in the outer areas, which we see from domestic undergraduates, towards self-contained studio units that are being built in the city centre, which is reflective of demand from international postgraduates. In terms of the numbers themselves, what we've seen is the council has approved over 17,000 bed spaces since 2017, and that includes 7,500 in the last 2 years alone. The Unipol report outlines that much of that new supply is reflective of the recent high specification accommodation from the international postgraduate intake to the University of Leeds from the Chinese market. The evidence suggests that the number of international postgraduates is expected to plateau actually over the next couple of years, and the demand for that type of PBSA is likely to flatline, and the demand for PBSA at a more affordable price point is likely to grow, and that's unlikely to be met by this current type of supply. As a result, there is likely to be a need for more moderately priced PBSA, maybe at a lower specification level in cluster flats rather than these expensive studios with high specification, and those policy options will be explored through Leeds Local Plan 2040. There's also a wider recognition of the context of the traditional form of student living in the co-living of HMOs in the outer areas, is that we're seeing evidence now that students are actually competing with young professionals in the private rental market for the same product. So houses that would previously traditionally be occupied by students now being occupied by young professionals that are renting. So the affordability of that traditional stock of on-street student housing has actually increased, and there's issues over the quality that's been provided because the demand's increased so much as well. So we think that additionality to the wider housing stock may relieve some of that pressure for students in the outer areas, but there's certainly a difference between the demand for accommodation from the domestic undergraduates as opposed to the international postgraduate market, and we need to be across the differences between that marriage. In terms of older person housing, again, there's a significant need for older persons housing across the district. The SHMAR calculates that 8,805 additional units of accommodation are required for older people by 2040. It would include a particular need for the C3 type extra care accommodation supported living. That makes up the majority of that need, but in addition to that, some extra care, the C2 type accommodation from extra care, and then a modest but not insignificant amount of care homes, of bed spaces are required, but a much lower level. The older person's housing demand is derived from the extra care and independent living with some supported facilities rather than bed spaces in care homes. That's to be grappled with through new policy again. In terms of specialist housing, the SHMAR recognises that the need for supported living accommodation and extra care is not just age related, and I think that's a shift from where we've been before. We've looked at extra care and always thought that that's an age related product, and indeed I think sometimes we seek to condition schemes to be occupied by occupants that are over the age of 55, for example, or over the age of 65. I think we're shifting away from that. We've got more detailed understanding that extra care is for everyone. It can be health related, it can be life experience related, and although it's difficult to set the precise figure onto the amount that is required for those purposes, the SHMAR is clear that the council must use this evidence to inform the local plan and wider housing strategies to support the opportunities for those specialist developments rather than keep them restricted to one type of occupant. So, as we've discussed in the previous item, the recent proposals and updates have implications for both housing needs and supply in Leeds. Firstly, the government's reform to the NPPF. The proposed standard method takes a stock level approach and incorporates an uplift based on an increased affordability multiplier. And really the heart of the proposed changes to the NPPF are designed to significantly increase housing land supply across the board, across the country, in all areas, all markets. That's perhaps a shift from the current mechanism for the standard method, which seeks to apply an uplift in urban areas on previously developed land. So what that means in numbers terms is the new calculation generates a target of 4,159 per annum in Leeds, which is nearly 1,000 more than the existing or the core strategy target as adopted. It's broadly equivalent to the current standard method, including the urban uplift, although, as I've just mentioned, that urban uplift is specified to be focused on previously developed land, whereas the proposed standard method does not make that specification. That would be up for the council to make a strategy decision through the Leeds Local Plan 2040. So the strategy position on that is going to become very important, and the council needs to have a clear direction of travel on that. As a result of these changes, there will need to be an addendum to the SHMAR as part of the publication suite of documents to update and set out the implications of these proposed reforms once they are known, and we're hoping that we'll have a clearer understanding of the fixed position and the end position by the end of this year. At the same time as the NPPF has been under consultation, the core strategy turned 5 years old on the 11th of September, so last week. In line with the NPPF, the housing requirement is now the current standard method, including the uplift, because the previously adopted core strategy became 5 years old, and at that point, from that day afterwards, the housing target is replaced by the government standard method, which is currently the standard method, including the urban uplift, with the most up-to-date affordability ratio from the ONS. That would see us today with a housing target of 3,987 per annum. Now, this will apply until it's replaced by a new standard method, And the immediate impact of that is upon the council's 5-year housing land supply. And we've been aware and we've been comfortable for quite some time that we've had an excess of 5 years for a number of years, and we've had a very healthy housing land supply position, 7.7 years in the previous 2013 SHLA and 5-year housing land supply statement. What we can do today, following the change in housing target from last week, is we can apply these new requirements, and we can see immediately that the 5-year land supply is reduced from 7.7 years to between 6.1 years and 6.4 years, depending on the emergence of those targets. Whilst this remains a healthy level of supply, the headroom is clearly reduced, and the supply remains dependent upon the stock of planning permissions that we have in the city centre. Therefore, it's important that the city centre market continues to deliver, and that while that is continuing to deliver, that the wider supply is maintained through the approval of schemes across all locations in the outer areas. And that's perhaps given heightened importance given the decrease in the level of supply reflective of the increase in the requirements that are required. In terms of the next steps, we see that the SHMA will be published on the council's website, and it will become a material consideration for the determination of planning applications upon its publication. The evidence will be used by the council to support the draft policy proposals in Leeds Local Plan 2040, and looking at the numbers for the 5-year housing land supply, a more accurate and more up-to-date position will be published as part of the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment 2024 update, which will be published by the end of the year. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions or comments on that presentation? Councillor Hazelwood.
Yeah, just on the student accommodation that we have, it is absolutely necessary that we start to build more affordable student accommodation. We've got evidence the last couple of years that the applications for 18-year-olds going to university are falling, and one of the factors in that is the from home, because people just can't afford it. You know, they're either having to take maximum student loans, and parents just can't afford the amounts. And I'm not just saying that's in Leeds. That's, you know, I've looked around for my son at other universities. London is just astronomical. You know, I'm looking at his deferred a year, and I'm really happy about that. I can have another look. You know, it is absolutely astronomical the amount that these new build student accommodations are charging everywhere. So it is really important, because we're preventing people, you know, young people going to university. The cost is a preventative factor of that accommodation now. It's not like it used to be, and that really is stopping, because a lot of the HMOs that we had, well, some of the HMOs have now gone back into family ownership. You know, certainly in my ward that's happened, which is welcome. We need the housing. However, that cheaper accommodation has now gone as a result, and people are having to live in these purpose-built student accommodations, which are much more expensive. And I agree that, you know, in my ward, where the HMOs do still exist, they are now young professionals who are sharing those HMOs as opposed to students, because they can't afford to rent somewhere by themselves, and they're now sharing those houses as young professionals because we don't have those rent caps. So, you know, the rent is just astronomical everywhere. So yeah, we absolutely do need to make sure that we are building affordable student accommodation going forward, because it really is a preventative factor for people.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally agree. I think that's what we've set out in the evidence. That's what the evidence is presenting to us. It's a question for us now as to what's the policy response to that? How do we make it more affordable? And I think there are two sides to that, as I've explained. One is within the traditional stock, is if we make increases to the wider housing stock, that will relieve pressure on students competing with young professionals. And then the secondly is how do we change, or how do we steer the delivery of a product in the city centre that's not high cost, high specification? And we're looking at options in terms of the approach that Nottingham have taken to identify particular locations for PBSA, but also to specify the mix of PBSA that's required, so that a mix is provided in clusters that might be more affordable, not only to postgraduates from the international market, but also to domestic students on undergraduate courses and postgraduate courses just across the board, really. So it's yeah, it's taking that context, looking at the evidence and translating that into a policy response, putting that out for new proposals.
My favourite topic of the city centre, though I am trying to establish whether I'm a young or an old professional. I hate that phrase. I don't even know what it means. Anyway. Oh! Wow, testy. I'm definitely going for a midlife crisis. Right. As we've discussed quite a bit, obviously the city centre is delivering a lot of our target and a lot of our permissions, but we still have this idea of the city centre being something for 20-year-olds. They're definitely on the young side. And students, rather than actually what it is. I mean, I certainly look from my workload as a counsellor, and I'm getting all the same issues you normally get with older people in communities, with families in the communities. How much, when we're looking at this, do we feel that this is picked up, actually, the demographic change, but actually also, even if that change isn't significantly bigger than, actually for the next couple of years it is going to be the city centre that's delivering the properties for us, and how much are we actually doing to change our planning policy to actually take advantage of that? And I go to the 5% affordables for the city centre, which is ridiculous, bearing in mind actually the number of people that move in the families. Obviously it has a massive impact on, do we have, I mean, I know I'm sure city plans do, I know we've done in South and West when it's come to my panel, talk conversations about family-friendly developments, because actually they're not designed to, because we've designed them to be for the young professional and not the retired market, not the market with people with disabilities, not the market with people with younger kids. So how much of this is actually filtering through to actually trying to start to change some of that conversation about the city centre? Not just because the city centre has changed, and my inbox definitely shows that, but also because actually for the next couple of years, for us to get anywhere near our targets, we need the city centre, where it's really the only place that is delivering permissions once they're granted on scale, to actually soak up some of the demand we have in the truly affordable end of the market, in terms of retirement homes, in terms of some of those adapted properties, because they build on scale.
Do you want to take that, Matt?
Yeah, clearly the SHMA and the work of Edge Analytics gives us a really rich understanding of the demographics of the city centre in terms of the outputs of the census and the understanding of the existing dwelling stock in the city centre. But in terms of planning for the wider communities within the city centre, then that's to look at proposals through wider housing strategies, including the transformational fund, in terms of what can we bring forward at different densities, what communities can be planned for in master planning terms, and providing different types of accommodation in and around the city centre in those new locations. But it would be for that wider master planning to take place through the local plan, reflective of the housing strategies that the council's pursuing with the government, I would imagine. Adam, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as well, though, one of the things that's really beneficial with the new SHMA is it gives us a lot more nuanced information about kind of bedroom sizes that we would expect in certain localities. So I think a lot of what's coming through there is that understanding, as you say, Councillor Ray, that more families, more people with elderly accommodation are wanting sort of bigger properties. And that does come through in the SHMA, and we know that will be a challenge, because we know that developers will want to see a proven demand rather than necessarily a need, which is obviously a complex debate. But it's, as Matt said previously on other responses, now the job is to formulate a policy response. How do you turn this evidence into an actual strategy? And that's our job, moving forward. Is how do we turn that into policy that bites, that actually sees a change and delivers that accommodation, that creates that family-friendly space that we're all looking for in the city centre. I think, as you reflect, Councillor Ray, it's partly happening by accident anyway, because the city centre is a really attractive place for lots of different people to be for lots of different reasons. Great place to be when you've got lots of services on your doorstep. And if you've got limited mobility needs, it's actually a really good place too, particularly if you've got good lift access to an apartment and level of access and all that kind of stuff. So it's already happening to a degree, but how much can we support that? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think it's how we formulate that policy response, I think, now, and make that happen more deliberately, I suppose, rather than just accidentally.
Councillor Lennox.
Thank you. Just to echo people's comments about affordable purpose-built student accommodation. I mean, that is, well, I don't need to say anything more. It's really clear that there has to be that model has to evolve, because it's going to completely fall over if no one is going to university and using those, and if the international students are not coming in the numbers that they were, it's going to completely fall over. I just wanted to ask, so the household income and housing costs piece between about page 70, about 67 onwards, it says it's 2002. Is that before the mini budget of 2002? Are these calculations made before the effects on rental costs, etc., and mortgage costs after that? Either way, this is a really useful tool for us to look at in terms of income and affordability. But it'd just be helpful to know whether they are, whether these are. So it says 2022 average prices. Is that also 2022 average earnings? Is it all from then, or has any of it been adjusted since?
Yeah, I think the data sets would be from a base date of the 1st of April 2022, which is the commission of the SHMAR base date, yeah.
Thank you. I thought that was the case. I just thought we'd check. In that case, it would be really interesting, and I'm not asking you to do a whole new SHMAR straight away, but it would be really interesting, and we can obviously consider what that, if we had up to the minute data about this, what that would now look like, given what's happened to pricing for houses, for mortgages, for affordability, for further stagnation of wages since that mini budget of 2022. But what I think I would encourage everyone to look at the graph on page 72 of the 200 pages of the SHMAR. There's great big lines across that say that the only affordable rent or tenure for average earnings in Leeds is social rent. And this is why we are desperately in need of meaningful affordable housing coming through in the new planning policy forum, planning policy framework, and in whatever tool. I'm saying the same as I said last time. Whatever toolkit the government's going to give us, it has to focus on meaningful affordability, and we can't wait. We can't simply wait for years of growth to bring us back to the level that we're at, where wages should be where they are and where employment levels are where they are, and especially not if we're getting less and less people going through university. You know, there's going to be years of work to get growth back, to get wages back to where they should be. And the one thing that we need to push for with everything that we can, with whenever we are having those conversations with government, is easy, quick changes, or easy and quick is possibly not the way to sell it to government, but practical, flexible sort of tools that we can use to use our local leverage to get the most affordable units built as possible, or purchased, or acquired as possible, because we can't continue to watch people lose their homes because the landlords want to put the rents up, so they do a Section 21. Luckily, that should be ending later next year. But when rents are set as they are, we can't continue to just watch people lose their homes, have nowhere to live in overcrowded situations, not be able to move out from their parents' houses, not be able to. This is a sort of visual indication of what the building blocks of this crisis are that has happened over the last 20 years. And I think this is a really important document and a really important foundation for us moving forward. And I'm very grateful to the work that's gone into this, because this completely illustrates the approach that we, as a city, delivering housing for people who work in our city, who live in our city, who are from, grow up in our city, grow old in our city, we now have this evidence.
Yeah, I echo many of those points. I think just in terms of the changing evidence, that's really the difficulty of planning, is trying to have a fixed position within a changing context, and we've seen that the housing target can quickly change. In terms of the evidence that we've got for the SHMAR, we know that evidence will change from the base date, and we can provide updates and as an addendum to the SHMAR as we move through the plan making process. So that's certainly something that is possible. We can look at bringing up to date or refreshing some of that evidence to see whether that picture has changed and how significantly it may have changed. Just in terms of the outputs for affordability, I mean, I think they're stark, aren't they? But they're not surprising. But what the SMART does unequivocally is put front and centre the need for affordable homes. I think that's the key headline, and that's something that the SMART makes very clear, including the need for social rent. So I think the SMART makes a recommendation that 80% be for social rent, and it just draws out the requirement of households for that type of product. But that's also reflective of the wider housing market, because everybody knows the more difficult it is for you to buy a home, the more pressure there is for social rented properties. That's how the wider housing market and the social rental market interact. And as you said, what the Commission does is it allows us to publish a position in evidential terms that supports not only Leeds' local plan, but supports the Council's wider housing strategies for regeneration, including the delivery of affordable housing schemes and maximising delivery of affordable housing right across the board where possible. So it's important that we get this evidence published so that the Council can use it to its benefit.
That's literally what I was just going to say. This should give us the confidence in going forward as a planning authority, as a local authority trying to work with our partners to deliver housing. This should give us the confidence to be very clear about what our expectations are.
Thank you. Councillor Hesselwood.
Yeah, just following on from Councillor Ray's point about the city centre and talking about, you know, policy and strategy. We look at applications time and time again, and we have a high level of 1 bedroom, a high level of 2 bedroom apartments or flats, and a minute amount of 3 beds. And if we're looking at the same page 72, I don't know, well, sometimes they're numbered a bit differently. If you look at the stock total, dwelling stock total in Leeds, the number of 3 bedroom flats is less than 1%. And if we're going to encourage families into the centre, families do want to live in the city centre. If we look at, you know, other countries and their built-up cities, they have lots of families that live in city centres because it is accessible and it is easy to get around. Then, you know, we really need to look at that because every time we look at a planning application, the amount of 3 beds is so small. Then we're never going to achieve that. We're never going to deliver that. And when we're talking about policy strategy, then those 3 bed or more apartments in the city centre or in all developments, you know, around in just around the city, you know, the outskirts of the city centre as well. We need that to encourage families, and again, it's part of that affordable. Making housing more affordable for people as well, rather than, you know, only being able to rent or buy a 3-bedroom house. You can rent or buy a 3-bedroom flat or apartment as well. So we really do need to look at that.
Yeah, I agree with those comments. I think we've known for quite a while now that the demand in the city centre, at least, is not just for student accommodation and young professionals in the build-to-rent market. Because a few years ago we were aware of the Strata scheme at Otter Island, which was a scheme for over 100 dwellings that were marketed for young families, well, not just young families, family homes really, which included 2, 3 and 4 bed properties. And I think that of that year had the highest build-out rate of any scheme across the city. I think they built out 103 or 104 dwellings within a year. So the demand was there. We knew that they could have sold that 3 times over is what the developers told us. But it's a case of finding the locations for that type of opportunity and providing landowners and developers with those sites so they can deliver those types of schemes at that particular density with the right mix. And I think this evidence does give us that option. It sets out a requirement or a need at least for not only 1 and 2 beds in the city centre, but 3 and 4 beds and a different type of accommodation that might be provided to meet the needs of not only students and young professionals, but also families and older persons as well. So they're opportunities that are presented to us.
Councillor Lamb. Oh, sorry, Campbell first, then Lamb.
This is a can of worms, quite frankly, and I think the comments, we keep coming back to this issue about affordability, don't we? And as a general point, I think affordability works two ways, doesn't it? One is it expensive to buy? And the second way is, how much do you earn? And I think there's an element of not just saying, can we drop the price of houses, but can we actually start paying people what they're worth? And I think that's an issue in that we're in many ways a low-wage economy. So actually, and the difference between low-wage earners and high-wage earners has got worse over the years, quite frankly, during the time I've been on the council. So we three will tell you that in the area we represent, houses still sell. There isn't a huge mass of very expensive houses sitting in Wetherby or Otley or Adel that can't sell. So there are people out there with enough money to do that. But our problem relates to that ever-increasing group of people that I suppose you describe as the bottom end, who are in jobs that really don't pay enough to allow them to buy property. And I think it's a two-pronged approach. You can't just simply say we need to lower the price of houses, we need to get paying people more. Now, you know. Well, I'll come back to my point, but I think there's an issue, isn't there, in relation to you may be startled to hear this, but the one thing that Mrs. Thatcher said that I have to agree with is you can't book the market. And I think that's an issue that we're seeing at the moment, is the market is driving this in a particular way. And we cannot, through a planning policy, change that direction. There has to be a much wider change of view as to what's a priority and what isn't a priority. A couple of things, I've been making a few notes, and so it's a bit of a shotgun, as usual, from me. The first figure you showed us about the affordable shortfall. I just wonder if that's a valid figure anymore, because, okay, last year we didn't get enough, we didn't meet our target. The year before that we didn't meet our target. The year before that we didn't meet our target. I think only about 1 year out of the last 10 have we met the target. I think trying to back claim that, which is what we're doing, isn't it? You know, we're never going to get that back. So we're never going to persuade developers to put in extra affordable units to catch up where we've fallen behind. I think we just need to face facts that that's never going to happen. I'd like it to happen, but it never will. We talked about variety, didn't we? And I think we really should be saying it's not just about the city centre, it's about variety for all communities. So we need to be building in that variety. And if you talk about 3 bedrooms, particularly in the city centre, is, let's be brutally honest, plans panels need more backbone to stick to our policy. And I think we sit here and wring our hands at city plans in particular and say there's not enough 3-bedroom units in this block. But do we ever say, right, so in that case we're not going to pass it? No, we never say that. So we perpetuate this thing that, yeah, developers will come along and say to us, yeah, we put 5% 3-bedroom flats in there. What they know, and the evidence they keep coming back with, is that they don't go to families, they go to 3 friends who do, like that program on the television, Friends, actually co-rent, and that's what that sort of property is going to. I agree with the point about old people in the city centre. Actually, I know I'm in early middle age, but when I do get to be old, the city centre is an ideal location. Why? Because it's got everything I want. It's got shops, it's got the theatre, it's got the LGI. You know, it's got everything you want. So there we are. I'd just like to touch on this Unipol document, because it's really irritating me reading it. if I'm honest. Sorry. Right, two things. One, a jokey thing. If we built HS2, your son could have commuted down to London for university without a problem. And the comment, and it's interesting how the student market's changed quite dramatically over the last 20 years. So number one is I can remember the first applications for purpose-built student flats. And we all said, this will never go. You won't be able to do, you know, you might get one or two, but this will never take off. And in fact, it's the huge growth. So there's a huge demand out there for purpose-built student accommodation. Now we talk about it being expensive, and relatively it is expensive, I think. If you were a parent and your son, daughter was asking you to divvy up for that, you'd be raising your eyebrow. But I do think about that, and I think about the two that are currently being constructed in the city centre, the one over what was Debenhams, etc. It's not wrong that the people who are going into that have effectively parents who can pay a lot of money, because you put in, I think, relatively affluent individuals into the city centre. And I think if we took them out, the effect on the city centre, the economic effect on the city centre would be quite dramatic. So there's a plus side to having students in the city centre, and that's the economic plus side, because it keeps a lot more of those businesses within the city centre going to service those people who, let's be honest, have disposable income. That's always been the thing about students, isn't it? They had disposable income. They're there in the city centre, they're providing a huge, great resource. I'll touch on the Headingley HMOs. Again, because the world's changed. I can remember when we were having this, if we'd had this discussion 20 years ago, the discussion would have been, how do we get students out of the Headingley HMOs and get real people back into them? And now the issue seems to be that we're actually real people going into those, and students are being displaced. It's a difficult decision to make, because I think the market has moved, and we were not anticipating it. We've never been really being able to anticipate the housing market, but the market's moved. The type of accommodation that students require has changed. The expectations of students in particular has changed. And I think I get the opinion that the person who wrote this was the sort of person who says to you, well, when I was a student, there were 27 of us living in a cardboard box, and we thought it didn't do us any harm. Actually, what students want now is what you and I might want, which is reasonable conditions. They want to be warm, they want to be comfy, they want to have access to friends. They want basic facilities within their room. They want a shower, they want a toilet. And why not? And so, as you probably know, I've been arguing for a very long time about the council having basic standards for student accommodation. And what the Unipol document seems to be saying to me is, actually, they're only students. We ought to be providing them with accommodation which we believe is substandard. So basic student accommodation that goes through the planning system is not that luxurious, quite frankly. What they're saying to us is you reduce the standards. Now, I thought the whole idea and the whole rationale of this council was that we were trying to up the standard, particularly around rented accommodation. That might be for students, it might be for old people, it might be for everybody. The quality of rented accommodation in this city and in this country is in many ways quite appalling. You talked about in Europe people live in the city centres. They certainly do, but they live in quality accommodation. They live in accommodation which far exceeds the basic standard we expect here. And I think we should be driving things up, not driving them down. That's a personal view. My final point, forgive me, is well, I'm going to refer to you because it applies to you as it does for me, and it probably applies to you too. You're raising the issue of students and purpose-built student accommodation. We've got exactly the same issue, but in our case, it's purpose-built accommodation for older people. So we're getting lots of applications for large developments which are for older people. Not that we're going into them, but we're... So it goes... I'm decrepit, not that way. So it goes back... No, I've said quite categorically, if I downsize, I'm moving nearer to the facilities. So actually, I might look again at the city centre in Leeds. I'll be emailing you every day. But I think it goes back to my point, which is...
Can you get to that point, please, Councillor Campbell?
Chair, if you really want me to, I could go through this in detail, but it's part of that point about the wider community and getting wider variety into all the community. And I don't want us fixating on students in the city centre, because that actually there are things we could do, but I don't think the unipol approach is the best one.
Yes, please. Yeah, just I'll pick on some of the observations, and Adam might want to follow up on that. Just in terms of when we're talking about earnings and house prices, that's literally how the government's affordability multiplier works. So the affordability ratio is based on ONS median earnings versus house price, and anything that's above 4 increases the housing target, reflective of affordability. So in those terms, as you suggested, the only way to grapple with that is either to increase the median earnings or to lower the house prices. And that's how the affordability ratio works. So that's the correct understanding. In terms of whether we've got to the right figure in the SHMA as to the overall quantum of affordable housing required, we believe we have, because to run backwards on previous delivery wouldn't be appropriate in the SHMA, because the SHMA guidance says that it resets the clock on evidence at a base date. So the difficulty of looking backwards on delivery is that the actual affordable housing target is made up of 2 components. One component is the net arising need. So that's the amount that you need to provide each year to meet needs that are newly generated. And then the second part of it is the contribution that you make to backlog. So if we looked at the core strategy target of 1,230, around 800 of that is made up of backlog. So in effect, if you were to deliver over 600, then anything greater than that would be a contribution to remedying the backlog. So you'd be making inroads to lowering the backlog on the waiting list. The difficulty of looking back and making that calculation is that the backlog is set to a base date, so you can't see whether the contributions that you're making to the backlog are greater or less than the newly arising households that are becoming part of the council's waiting list, which is why you have to continually reset the clock through a SHMA process. So we think that's the correct approach, and it's certainly the approach that's set out in national guidance. Agree with you in terms of providing the variety of households that are needed. I think what the SHMA does is really quite clearly say that we need more of everything everywhere, really, and some things more than others. But it is the case that the full extent of the housing types that are required across the district need to be increased across the board, and I think that the SHMA sets that out quite clearly. In the Unipol report, I think we're conscious that the Student Housing Working Group is made up of the council and the universities, the student unions, Leeds Property Associations, but we're certainly not bound by the evidence. It's a rich source of data in terms of the research that's been done, but it doesn't preclude us from undertaking our own research or coming to our own observations and our own recommendations in policy terms. Previously, we'd explored space standards within student accommodations and improving the quality, or setting standards to ensure the quality of new schemes, and that's not something that's taken off the table. That's something that the council can look at picking up again and putting through, probably not through the supplementary planning document, but certainly through new proposals in the Leeds local plan. So we're not bound by the Unipol evidence. We understand that it's a rich source of research that's been undertaken through that group. Improving the quality of the wider housing stock, including the private rental sector. I think we're aware of that, and we know that, and we mentioned just previously that the HMOs in the outer areas that were traditionally occupied by domestic undergraduates, we're conscious that because of the increase in demand and the competition with the young professional sector, we know of incidents, albeit anecdotally, there are examples and there are anecdotal evidence that the quality of the HMO product and the co-living households in those outer areas has decreased because demand's increased. So landlords are no longer providing standards or are letting out properties that are not to the condition that they previously would be when that demand wasn't quite so high. So we see part of the answer to that being additionality to the wider housing stock, but we need to look at, or we can certainly look at, other improvements we can make in policy terms in reflection of that, and how we can ensure the quality of the existing stock and the living experience of the occupants in those areas.
Councillor Lamb.
I'm trying to remember what I wanted to say when I put my hand up now. So just a brief observation about affordability. Every one of us says we'd want to see cheaper houses, but there's two significant interest groups who do not want to see cheaper houses, and that's people that already own houses and people that build houses, and that fundamentally is the problem. So on the hypothesis, it's wages that need to go up to catch up, and it comes on to a second point where I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how the housing need balances need versus demand. So in outer areas, as Councillor Campbell alluded to, there's no issue selling 4 and 5 bedroom executive homes. You could almost build as many as you want and someone would buy them. The average house price in my ward is about £450,000. I work in hospitality. Getting people in hospitality near to the jobs in outer areas is a huge challenge, and it comes back to what is really affordable again, and when you're identifying what the housing mix is, that's where my question is, how does this balance need versus demand? Because you could build lots of expensive houses in our area, but the need actually, that's not where it is, and if we want employment to grow, well, mass transit might not be going to come to my area. We'll have a significant role to play in delivering it at Thorpe Arch Trading Estate, for example, and other places. The supply chains will come, and people need to be able to access the jobs that are there. Public transport's not great, so you need affordable, properly affordable houses that's close to the jobs, and it's a nightmare trying to get staff in relatively low wage industries, even for those that pay as much as the business can support. So that's one point. The second bit's totally unrelated. Around, so we have very clear evidence and guidelines, and we're very specific about the needs for older people's housing. And I've made this point a couple of times in previous meetings around when we talk about other groups and specialist housing for those groups. I don't think we're anywhere near as specific as we should be. And I wonder if there's a little separate piece of work that could be done in addendum to this, to really identify the need for those who are 18 to 64 who need some form of supported living, that could live independent and fulfilling lives with the kind of housing that we build for older people in our areas, with shared space and cafes and support on site. And it would be really useful to see that captured. And then my final question, I just on page 145 on the table about learning disability groups, and the projection, so it says 2020, all disorders 6,091, 2040, the projection is 6,353. With our knowledge of all the pressures on SEND and the increase in young people needing the HCPs, it didn't quite ring true for me that was, in 20 years, we're going to see an increase of about 250 adults with, what have we described as here, with some form of learning disability. And I just wondered if we could dig into that, because it doesn't quite sit with the lived experience that we all have from casework and our knowledge of schools and things. So I'm just a bit doubtful about that.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, questions. On affordability and housing need versus demand, that's two-sided really, because the overall housing requirement doesn't necessarily look at needs, it looks at household projections and the formation of households. So that's as it stands with the current standard method. So what that does is it projects forward the formation of households from previous years, so it's simply a continuation of past trends, if you like. The criticism of that is that it bakes in the under-delivery of houses, meaning that the household formation was suppressed. That was the chief criticism of that approach, because it didn't look at demand, it was based on household projections, and they themselves baked in under-delivery. So the government's response to that through the proposed standard method is to take a stock-based approach, which we've spoken about, and to increase the stock by 0.8%. That's not necessarily a needs-based scenario either. It's a calculation of just increasing the stock, I guess on the understanding that there is across-the-board need, so increasing the stock meets those needs. What we do have rich evidence on is needs of affordable housing through the household survey and the work that the consultants have done in the SHMA to identify the size and type of properties and tenure that is needed by location based on the responses of the household survey and the engagement that we've had with stakeholders. So we have our own understanding of, away from the overall housing requirement, within that, what's the locational needs by size, type and tenure across the district by the 11 sub-areas. So we have that evidence, and it's up for us to make a strategy decision as to how do we reflect that need in land allocations and the strategy for delivering homes. Those are questions that we need to answer ourselves. Part of that can be based on making land allocations where the greatest affordable need is, but also you need to be mindful that you still want to maximise your existing capacity. So there's strategy decisions to be made as to taking the evidence on need and translating that into a strategy for land allocations, and that's with the council to make that decision, including just in terms of the other groups that we spoke about and the requirement and for supported living for persons that are 18 to 64 years old. I know you've mentioned that in a couple of meetings before, and we've been thinking about that quite a bit recently, haven't we? Certainly I've been thinking about it in terms of the conditions that are made on planning applications. It just as recently as last week, because as I've spoken about, what's generally happened on extra care and supported living schemes is that they've been conditioned to age-related occupancy, so conditioned that they be occupied by persons that are over 65 years old, and we're walking away from that now. We think we've got a better understanding that through the SHMA, albeit it's very, very difficult to quantify, as you've suggested, or as if you've suggested that we do some work to be able to quantify it, which I agree with, is that we're now seeking that extra care schemes not only be age-related, but also be open to health-related, learning-related and life experience-related needs as well. So not restricting that in condition terms. So that's one way of looking at it in development management terms. Another way in land allocations is that I think, again, in the previous site allocations plan, we identified sites within the wider housing allocations that were suitable for older persons housing. Now, if we were to do that again, I think we'd look at identifying sites what not only suitable for older persons housing but suitable for extra care housing, including those specific groups when we can get the evidence for it. So I think we're there. I think we've moved on from what our position was previously. This SHMAR gives us the hook to understand why we had to move on, but it doesn't give us the numbers. It doesn't tell us exactly how much we need, where we need it. And I think if we want to do that, which I think is a good idea, we'd have to commission a bit more research, or at least look with colleagues across adults and health to be able to do that research, so that we have the confidence in our convictions to move that forward with land allocations if required, or at least be supportive of those schemes in policy terms if they can't be part of specific land requirements. I guess the difficulty with that is having developers that come forward with those types of schemes, because I think extra care has really been geared to the older persons accommodation market, because there's a demand for that in marketability terms, whereas it's much more difficult to see the market for extra care for health-related needs, including people with learning disabilities, autism. You can see where the demand is. It's pulling that out, isn't it? So I'd like to take that on a little bit further, and just link into that the numbers that you mentioned in the table. I don't know whether they need to be sense checked or not. What I would say is that they were processed and produced by the consultants in partnership with colleagues as part of the steering groups for adults and health, but I think it might be prudent to go back to our colleagues in adults and health and just sense check those and make sure they're correct before it goes onto the website, because if there's alternative and if there's better data, let's use that instead.
I think, thanks, Matt. I think it's just on that penultimate point. I think we can go away and scope out what that further research looks like, Councillor Lamb, because I think, as Matt mentions, there's some difficulties and complexities there about making sure we're even asking the right questions, which I think we clearly need to put some thought into to make sure that's a useful exercise and doesn't just get us to where we are now. So if we can kind of take that away and try and scope that work out, now we've got a kind of full SHMAR in hand, we can kind of see where the gaps are. It gives us I think puts us in a better position to ask questions, I think. So if we can take that away and we can try and scope that through.
Just on your comment, Councillor Lamb, about numbers of children, young people in the queue for EHCPs compared to the numbers needing supported living, they won't equate. There are plenty of children in the queue for EHCPs who will live independently, perfectly happily, just need support during education. So those two figures I don't think would equate. Okay, Councillor Carlow.
Thank you. I'll try not to be too long. It was nice to get the confirmation that Colin's early middle age, because I've been wondering when. I've always said I've got nearly all the privileges as a white, straight, middle-class man, and I've been waiting when middle age comes so I can complete the whole set. But luckily at 40, I think I'm not quite there yet, so I'll save up that one for later. But in terms of affordability, and I've noticed, I mean, in the report, there's the bit of the agents review, which is quite clear in my area of the Outer West, and actually it signifies the situation that I see on the ground. Those of whom sit on the South and West Plans panel will have had the joy of looking at my extension recently, which I think you enjoyed looking at in detail, but that's because wages may go up or down, house prices may go up or down, but children certainly get bigger. So I've had to look at that, and the only 4-bedroom houses that have been built in my area are 700,000 a piece. That's nearly four times what I paid for my house, and I cannot imagine how the majority of people are going to afford that. I don't know what myself and my wife would have to earn in order to get a mortgage for that. But that shows really that, there are people that will buy those. There are plenty of people that will buy them, unfortunately, and then it will keep the prices up at that level. But the development of the other houses won't then come along. But then, so just looking at where the report comes on the affordable housing and where that takes us to. So obviously, we're suggesting numbers of, so there's numbers around 4,000, let's say, for the number of homes needed a year. And there's suggestion that 2,000 of those would need to be affordable housing to meet the existing need and the possible growth. But we're not really going to come forward and find 50% affordable housing on every single development going forward. I note that it says only a proportion of these should be delivered through the planning process. However, I think it's been reasonably clear, and the government's been reasonably clear recently, that it expects the majority of affordable housing to come from these reforms of the planning process rather than from other specific funding. So where does this put us in terms of policy making? At the minute, we've got 7% in one area and 35% in another. Where does this suggest? I know we're not at that level yet, but I think it's useful for us to start thinking about it, that a policy should come around affordable housing. Obviously, there is a huge area, more than before, so we're expecting more than 35% in some areas, and certainly more than 7% in the ones that have the lower figure. And just one quick point of clarification, does this take into account the loss of affordable houses every year as well? So as well as the growth, does it take those that may be lost through right to buy and similar?
Yeah, thank you. The relationship between the overall target and the affordable housing need is the 4,000 to the 2,100. But it wouldn't be the case that you would seek to deliver a target of 2,100. The case is that that's the total quantum of affordable need based on remedying the entire backlog as it sits. So it would be in effect to remedy the council's position to affordable need to zero. So there'd be no homelessness. There'd be no persons or households on the council's waiting list. No one seeking affordable housing. So we wouldn't set a target to, albeit that would be the ambition. That would be the ambition of any authority, to set a position where you met all affordable needs to have a zero backlog. But that's not the case of any council across the country. We know that affordable needs are always going to exist. The position in planning terms is to make enough affordable housing delivery to maximise affordable housing delivery, to make significant inroads into that backlog, to reduce the affordable housing need. So the 2,100 isn't a target in itself, it's a recognition of that's the quantum of affordable need, and the council must do everything in its possible powers to maximise delivery, to make inroads to reducing that need. So you wouldn't set it as a policy target in those terms. Whether or not that requirement takes into account the loss of affordable housing, it does, yes. So it projects forward the existing stock of affordable housing, and it looks at what that stock is going to look like over the next 5 years and builds in the programmes that the council have got to either make additionalities or losses to that as part of right to buy.
Just thanks, Martin. Thanks, Councillor Collar. I think another point. I think the point in terms of how the planning system delivers that, Matt will know the data better than I do, but it's about the proportion of different programmes. So clearly, you know, when you're on plans panels granting proportions of affordable housing, that's in the main coming through your Section 106 agreements, which is kind of how we badge the planning contribution. But also, clearly, we've got council housing growth schemes that are delivering affordable housing. We've also got work, particularly with our regeneration colleagues, on registered providers who are delivering some of the 100% affordable schemes that have been referred to, which clearly are being granted planning consent, but they're not necessarily what we would constitute as coming through, being delivered by Section 106. They've been delivered by those registered providers. So there's a fairly balanced mix of those three sort of broad routes. And I think in terms of what's the policy response, well, that's the question, isn't it? I think how do we go about increasing this number? How do we go about making sure that Section 106 contribution is maximised? We've talked about viability so much, and I don't want to reopen that debate, but you know, there's a reason why the numbers are set at 7%, 15% and 35%. That's because the economic viability study showed that was the maximum you could achieve viably in those broad locations. We'll obviously review that viability picture, but you know, and I don't know at this moment what those numbers are likely to be, but I don't think it'd be any spoiler to say that the viability picture has changed so beneficially that those numbers could be massively higher. That seems unrealistic at this point. But I think it's an interesting reflection from the government in terms of the 50% requirement on greenbelt sites. We've talked at sort of previous discussions about, well, if we were to release land from the greenbelt for housing, could that be of a much higher percentage of affordable? I think we'd like to be more ambitious than 50%, but that also helps a massive contribution, but that could only be achieved on those kind of greenbelt sites. That's not going to happen on your traditional brownfield city centre in a city site. That seems unrealistic. Clearly, there are some registered provider schemes and there are some council housing growth schemes that do achieve that, but not from your market housing deliverers. So I think it's about us looking in the toolbox, isn't it, and seeing how we use all these different levers. That's confused my metaphors there slightly, but trying to sort of work through what kind of tools we've got at our disposal and what the policy response is. But we are going to have to demonstrate that it is viable to be able to do so, which is I don't want to describe it as a hurdle, but that is one of the major aspects of plan making.
Councillor Anderson.
Well, most of what I was going to say has already been said, you'll be pleased to know. So just down to three points I want to make. One is, what level of granularity have you got to back up some of this data? The reason for asking is there was a recent challenge on our neighbourhood plan and they wanted us to have evidence, and I said, well, let's see what the SHMA comes up with, because that might be able to provide the, well, it's not, unless you've got the working tables behind it. So in other words, you've got them at area level, doesn't matter what the area, whether it be outer northwest, north or whatever, but have you got the granularity down? So that you can do it. And then the next point is, by looking throughout this document, and in particular the agent summary, no two areas are the same. And in order to get policies, we're going to have a lot of nuanced policies, otherwise you'll totally destroy some areas and leave other areas derelict, depending on how you get the nuance of what you're planning to do, because you'll lead to an oversupply and undersupply in terms of things. And the final thing is, on a flippant point, on page 243 or page 195, someone's been watching sci-fi too much and they've been calling it Westwood as opposed to Westworld, and it should be Wheatwood, I think, at the top of the page.
There's not much difference though.
One's a little bit in the future, but that's been pedantic. But it's more the nuances and how you're going to develop policies and whether or not that information is going to be available, because there are some neighbourhood plans must be coming forward to the need to be revised now, to use, and using this information will help them to inform it, particularly if you're increasing the housing numbers, because we will need to say to some of these neighbourhood planning areas, sorry, you're going to have to come forward with housing sites in your plan this time, otherwise you'll find that you get them given to you. And that's, so they need the information to make informed decisions.
Yeah, thank you. Granularity on evidence, I think the SHMA does have that behind it. It's all based on ONS output areas, so the community committee areas are snapped to output areas from the ONS for 1,000 population. So we can work our way down from the sub areas to middle super output areas to lower super output areas to output areas. So there's a level of granularity that you can work your way down from higher geographies to lower geographies as required, but obviously it's the lower the geography, the more opaque the information becomes, and how dense that is to be presented. Stakeholder, the nuances between those sub areas, that's for the Leeds local plan. I think when we come with proposals for how this translates to areas and settlements, we need to model these scenarios of need. So I think we're going to look at perhaps in excess of a handful of different scenarios, whether it be by sub-areas, whether it be by settlement hierarchy, and look at the different approaches and how they would present themselves in terms of needs for particular areas. So you could have an approach that just looked at, you could take the government's own approach of a stock-based uplift with affordability for each settlement or for each sub-area, but equally you could look at maximising the delivery of local brownfield opportunities, exhausting the current land supply of permissions. So it's putting those together into the right strategy, but we'll look at a range of scenarios that present themselves in different needs-based models and put those out for public consultation as to what the best approach is. But all the evidence that we have allows us to do that, really, and those could look quite different depending on the strategy that you decide to embark upon. And then finally, the amendments of Westwood, there's time to fix the typo, so I'll do that. Thank you for picking that up.
I think, Councillor Anderson, just to say, I mean, I think those agent summaries provide kind of useful flavour and a useful kind of data point. But as Matt's saying, that's not going to be the only factor that's going to be determining how we generate a strategy, obviously. That's true. Yeah. I think in some ways, I think that shows that granularity, doesn't it? It shows you that we recognise that a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to be helpful and is not representative of your communities. But there's also that sort of, it's where bottom-up meets top-down, isn't it? Where it needs to be a strategy we can communicate. And as Matt says, there's a few scenarios that we're working through, and when we get to consultation, we'll be able to take people through those strategies and the pros and cons of them, and hopefully have a helpful discussion on those.
Councillor Heselwood.
Thank you. A couple of points just to pick up what we may have forgotten about the point. We've been that long since I picked them up. I'm not wanting to drive standards down in the city centre. What I'm aiming for is, or asking for, is to get the housing mix right. Nobody wants to drive down the standards of living accommodation. We just want to make sure we've got a variety of the right sort of accommodation for people. And the notion that we should only have students in the city centre with all this disposable because their parents can afford for them to stay in these luxury student accommodations, that's not. I just disagree with that completely. There's nothing wrong with having a cluster, the old style, that universities have, where you have a shared kitchen living arrangement and you all have your separate bedrooms. The cluster student accommodation, where you might have 6, 8, and then you share the communal space. There's nothing wrong with building student accommodation like that, which is then cheaper. But those students will still have disposable income to spend in the city centre. What we need to do is get that mix right. It shouldn't just be the domain of very wealthy students whose parents can afford to pay those rents. And the house prices. I'm a house owner. I'm a homeowner. I have a 4-bedroom house, and I'd be happy if my if the cost of my house dropped, because it would all be relative, because everyone else's prices would drop. And when I decide to sell my house and move on, then the next house or flat I buy would be cheaper as well. So I would like that to happen, so that my children could actually get on the property ladder without me having to help them, quite frankly. If house prices drop, it's relative for all of us. It's not that my house has dropped and yours hasn't. They would all drop. Well, that's something. I'm not talking, 50% off the property, but we something needs to happen. And if house prices start to come down, even if that's marginally, we will all be, that will be across the board. And just one thing on the mix of housing that we're looking at. Retirement, we're talking about people who are retired. And I just wondered if we'd looked at retirement complexes as well as part of this, because I know my mum downsized when my dad died. She downsized and bought a retirement flat in a retirement complex. And I think it's in my ward, and I think they're really good. It's that, you know, you buy your own flat, you live independently. It's a bit like being a student, really, because then you've got this communal space that you all go have your coffee mornings in, and, you know, there's always a quiz going on. She has me coming in and doing the counsellor update and a bit of a coffee morning. There's always trips going on, you know, and for me, it really addresses that issue of loneliness for old people, and it's a better security as well than you know, opening your front door. You know, that kind of thing. There's a door before your door, and I just think I think it's a great complex. You know, that whole concept is great, and I think that's something maybe we should look more at for you know, we know that we've got assisted living and we know that we've got sheltered housing, but there's this in between, you know, where people don't need that help, but also they want to live somewhere where, you know, a bit like a student, where you've got similar the demographic around you that you can, you know, that you can interact with. So I think that's something that we should look at as well.
I think we've got 3 of those in my ward. Private council room. Yeah.
Just to say, I think that's very helpful clarification, Councillor Hazelwood. I think in terms of those standards, I think we've got the levers that we have in some respects, and I think absolutely take the point. I don't think anybody's trying to reduce standards to a substandard level. I think there's obviously a debate to be had about where that level is, isn't there? And I think Councillor Campbell made the point about setting perhaps a minimum standard that we agree should not be gone below. I think that the point that Matt's making in terms of the policy response is we know that cluster flats are just that bit more affordable than studio flats are. And that studio flat product at the moment does look quite luxurious and obviously attracts a certain kind of demographic. And yeah, as Councillor Campbell rightly says, clearly there is a market for that, and that is being successful and it's driving a lot of growth in city centre construction. But if the data suggests that that's not meeting needs and there is a policy response that can help that situation, that's what we need to consider through the local plan, by if we're sort of saying perhaps setting minimum amounts or proportions of cluster flats to make sure that need is also being met as well. I think in terms of retirement complexes, I think in some respects it's a market response, but we can certainly kind of take that away in terms of whether there's something more specific that we can say. I think sometimes these can be, I guess we need to kind of reflect on to what degree do we think they're not happening enough. If we think they are happening enough, then there isn't necessarily a reason for a policy response to it. But if we do think it's happening, if we don't think it's happening enough, then we can be more specific about the range of products we'd like providers to consider, certainly. So we can take that away.
Just a couple of quick questions, and I'm sure this will be quick answers, and just a couple of quick points. When this was being done, was this done with an assumption of the impending removal of Section 21? Because even until the previous government axed it, there was obviously a lot of talk of Section 21 going, and obviously a lot of this work would have been done at the same time, and that's going to have an impact on the delivery in the private rented market, and therefore the pressure into the rest of the system. Secondly, you talked about average incomes. Now, depending on which form of average you look at, you get a very different answer. So we're talking the mean average, or we're talking the mode average? Because if you come out with the mode, I'm sure you get actually a much lower level of affordability than if you come out with the medium income. So is that based on a national formula, or is that a decision that's done locally? And I think just picking up on kind of a couple of other comments, I think you're right, Colin, that a lot of the 2 and 3 beds have been taken up by people doing shared living, because actually it goes back to the point that was earlier, we're not actually creating the environment for family-friendly city centre living, because we're not thinking about the infrastructure, because our policies and our data have never got in. And it's nice to hear that planning seems to realise there's a great demand. Could that be told to the rest of the council that seems to think, again, only 20-year-olds live in the city centre? Because actually the problem is part of the institution obviously this feeds into is actually all the additional services and requirements that come on top of that. In terms of the neighbourhood data, and I think goes to the granularity you were on about, something like the city centre again is actually a really weird beast. A lot of it will be under the same local group in terms of the data. However, if I look at the north bank and the south bank of the river, it's completely different, actually. And if you look at north of city centre, north of City Square to the south of City Square, it's very different. You have a much more permanent community on the south of the river and the south of City Square, and a much more transient student population on the northern part of it. So actually, when we're talking about the granularity of turning this data into policy, actually, some of that sub-level data actually doesn't take account, because actually they were drawn at a point when actually the city centre was a very different makeup and a very different density of population. So actually, in itself, it's not actually overly useful data unless you actually start looking at some of those physical, natural boundaries, not just the statistical boundaries. There's a couple of other points, but I don't want to talk forever. Though I do like the fact I'm now a young professional, so thank you, Colin. I appreciate that intensely.
Yeah, a quick answer on the first two. Might link to Adam on the city centre parts, but in terms of the Section 21 notices for vacant possession from tenants, that was something that was considered through the Student Housing Working Group. Leeds Property Association made those observations, that was taken account of as part of that process. The lower or median earnings, the national formula is based on median earnings. You're quite right. If it was based on lower earnings, then affordability would be cut away quite significantly. And then on the city centre, the granularity of the data, yeah, it does take us to a certain point, but data geographies are just that, aren't they? Data geographies, you don't walk through data in the same way that you might walk through the city centre. That's something that we need to be aware of when we're looking at proposals, yeah.
Can I, 2 seconds to come back? You know, and I think it's really important, again, obviously, not to dwell on the city centre too much, but obviously it's delivering a lot of our housing at the moment. Actually, if you look in the inner city core around the nighttime economy, you're going to have a very different product come to than if you look literally 10 metres away on the other side of the river. And actually having that level of knowledge is going to be really important. The city centre is not one homogenous beast. It's got different communities, different needs, different requirements, and that actual understanding needs to be taken into consideration, because when it comes to city plans, if you have a request for a block of flats over next to a nightclub, you're probably going to get a very different product to if you then get it down, say, now down some of the redevelopments down near Leeds Dock, which is a very different market and feel to it. So I think it just goes for the outer areas, it also goes for some of those really high compact areas, and understanding that there is a significant difference in a very, very short space of travel. Sorry.
Councillor Campbell, do you have your hand up again?
Well, I wasn't suggesting that we should only allow rich students into the city centre. But I think it goes back to what I think we've all said. It's about mix. And it's about mix and balance across the entirety of the city. So the city centre currently is experiencing a boom with student numbers, without a doubt. As you said, south of the river, it's slightly different, because there's much more, I suppose, build-to-rent work going on down there. And if you look projected over the next 20 years, there'll be a very significant number of units south of the river, which will be covering a much wider area of demand. And I think price will always be an issue. But the thing that struck me about, we talk about the university complaining, is I'm thinking about the new block that's nearly finished over there, which was next to the College of Art, which is a former university building. If the university needs to step up as well, in my opinion, because they have the ability. I use that as an example. I don't think it was actually the university, but they should, or they could, if they'd been really concerned, have said, this is a block for 180, I think it is. We'd like you to make sure that 10% or 20% are available at an affordable rate. You could do that, that's their building, and you shouldn't really expect the planning system to do that for you. And I think your comment about the retirement complexes, that's the point I made. We're getting those in spades. I would say, well, that's not strictly true, but in effect, the outer areas, our area, and you touched on it yourself, I think we've got 3 at the moment in Otley, going through the system to provide what you've just simply described. And strangely enough, members of the public are contacting me and say, we've got too many old people here. But
don't take it personally, Colin.
well, I can't, because as I say, I'm in early middle age, so I have a way to go yet.
I get the feeling Councillors Anderson and Lamb are getting ready to pack up and leave. Okay. Unless the officers have anything further they want to raise on that particular issue without further debate, any further debate on anything, points of clarification or anything? Okay, we shall move on. I think the messages are there in that one. On item 9, update on Leeds Local Plan 2040.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and keep this very quick. Yes, I think largely for reasons that we've already touched on at this panel, particularly related to the National Planning Policy framework consultation. The view is sort of arrived that we feel that there are real benefits and reduced risks to instigating a bit of a delay, well, a pause in terms of consultation on the Leeds Local Plan 2040. We previously indicated to members that we'd be looking to do that this sort of autumn time. When that was sort of set, that was before the consultation on the MPPF was known, and the impacts in terms of the standard method, the housing numbers for Leeds, approaches to green belt, grey belt, also new proposals regarding how we consider employment land for things like data centres, affordable housing products, approaches to things like beauty and many more besides, all of which sort of impinge on Leeds Local Plan 2040. What we're keen to avoid is that we have a consultation in the autumn where we're answering a lot of government questions related to a national consultation and a national picture that we can't necessarily answer, but is really relevant context. So it's felt that there'd be real benefits in a short delay in terms of that consultation to a place when some of those questions, perhaps not all, but some of those questions have been answered through a newly published and finalised MPPF. Rest assured, in the meantime, there's still a huge amount of work to be gone at, some of which Matt has already detailed in terms of some of those policy options that we're currently working through, site assessments, greenbelt reviews, the list goes on. So it certainly doesn't represent a pause in the work. And we think that, as I say, there are, in terms of the overall timescales for Leeds Local Plan 2040 as a project, this won't impact in any significant degree and could actually save us time if this avoids us having to do another round of consultation that if we did this too soon. So yes, it's in terms of the paper, we suggest a slightly amended timetable for a delayed consultation to take place, hopefully sometime in the early new year following the publication of the MPPF. And I'll leave it there, Chair, because hopefully the paper explains itself well enough.
Can you turn your microphone off, please, Mr. Campbell? Thank you. Any comments or questions on that? No. Okay, thank you for that. We shall move on then to item 10, which is date and time of the next meeting, and it's bonfire night, or bonfire afternoon, 5th of November at 1:30. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you to the officers. Thank you. And thank you to anybody watching online.